Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us to have a conversation about how the kindergarten entry assessment aligns within a multi-tiered system of support. So we're really excited to have so many people interested in how these two initiatives are aligned together. I'm Erica Beatty. I'm the Southwest consultant for the K-3 form of assessment process, which involves the kindergarten entry assessment. And I have three other colleagues on the call with me, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves so you'll kind of be familiar with their voice. So whenever we're talking, you'll know who that is and who's addressing those questions. But before we get started, before they introduce themselves, just one logistical thing before we get started. To your right, there's a question box. So if you have questions throughout this conversation, we want this to be as much of a conversation as possible, but on GoToWebinar, you're automatically muted when you log in. However, if you raise your hand or type a question in the question box, we're going to stop like intermittently throughout the webinar so we can unmute you so you can ask the question. So either raise your hand and we'll unmute you so we can just have a conversation and you don't have to type out a lengthy question. Or if you feel more comfortable typing that in the question box, feel free to do that. And Carmen, the MTSS consultant, and I will be answering those questions as much as possible. So again, I'm Erica Beatty with the Kindergarten Entry Assessment. I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Good morning. I am Lynn Plummer. I am the MTSS coordinator for Stanley County Schools, and I also have had a big part in the rollout of KEA with Stanley County Schools in kindergarten classrooms. So kind of how I am here today, just kind of that crossover between how KEA fits into MTSS.
I'm Denise Scott. I'm a kindergarten teacher at Oak Grove Choice STEM School, and I've been doing KEA for about 3 years.
And I'm Carmen Mills. I'm the MTSS Regional Consultant for Region 6 and excited to be here and really excited about the conversation.
So before we get started, Carmen and I wanted just to provide a little bit of background information on the KEA and MTSS, but don't want to go into big, huge details, knowing that a lot of people are familiar with both, but knowing that there are some people on the call who may not be familiar with either initiative. So just to kind of give you an overview of the kindergarten entry assessment, it's actually a small part of a bigger kindergarten through third grade formative assessment process. And the vision behind this assessment was just sometimes as educators and as policy leaders, we sparse things into separate silos, like just for reading and math, but we know that children develop as whole beings. So our assessment really was about thinking about children and the approach to learning. Sometimes to know that they focus as they can, knowing that they develop as whole beings, we wanted to focus on the whole child. We didn't want it to stop instruction. We wanted it to be a very natural process that was embedded during the instructional day. And also knowing that teachers know children better than anyone, and they notice things all the time, and they're always taking notes. Like if you ask a teacher now about a child 2 years ago, they can tell you who they played with, they can tell you what their favorite subject was, they can usually even give you some information about data, what reading level they were on. So knowing that teachers see all these wonderful things and know these things in their head, we wanted them to be able to document that in a variety of ways. So our assessment also uses the evidence they gather to guide instruction. So we have a platform that we use that has construct progressions that have how a child development, how they learn over time. So this starts at a very fine age 3 level, and it's a fine-grained step-by-step level all the way to age 6 or age 10, depending if it's a K3 construct progression or a KEA progression. So in our handouts to the right, I've loaded the KEA construct progression book. Just if you're not familiar with that, you can kind of see what our construct progressions look like. But that's just the kind of big vision of our assessment, and I'll let Carmen share with you about MTSS.
Thank you, Erica. And for those of you who have not kind of heard a little bit about our state initiative in terms of MTSS, We look at it as a total school improvement framework. And so what you'll see here is just really thinking about what our 6 critical components are across the state. So as we work with MTSS coordinators and as we work with district level teams, we focus on more than that tiered system of support, but we really think about those things that you have to create and develop and enhance to really make any system sustainable and work well. And so we think about that in terms of leadership. How do we build our leadership capacity at the district level and then even at the school level? How do we build capacity and infrastructure for implementation? So what are those coaching opportunities and training opportunities that need to be made available to the staff, the district level staff and the school level staff? How do we communicate and collaborate with one another and then use data to then problem solve and evaluate what it is that we're doing? And then finally, how do we create the most effective 3-tiered instructional model that really supports all of our students? And I think that the work that we do in terms of a multi-tiered system of support meshes really well in terms of our formative assessment process, because it's a piece of that work that we're doing, and we're asking people to look at that data. We're asking people to think about a whole child approach. And so that's the reason why we were really excited to have this conversation about MTSS and KEA. And one of the things that I provided too was just a handout related to the 6 critical components that let you know a little bit more about MTSS also, but welcome any questions as well. Really quickly, Erica mentioned that you have handouts here located within the box here on the GoToWebinar control panel. In addition to that, we will send out basically just any notes that we take along with the survey at the end of this discussion, so that you'll have additional information. So don't hesitate to ask questions or get engaged in the conversation, because we'll have an opportunity to write some of that down as well. Thank you. Do you want to start with the questions now and just kind of jump into where we thought might be the most important thing, Lynn and Denise? And then, like we said, we'll have opportunities for you to ask questions, or you can ask questions here on the page.
Perfect. You ready to go? All right. So, Ms. Scott, how has the kindergarten entry assessment impacted your instruction to meet the needs of all students?
Well, it really makes the issues evident in a very simple way, and it tells you what their strengths and their weaknesses are on an individual basis. For example, this year I had a student that maybe if it wasn't for KEA, I wouldn't have noticed it so quickly, that he can count to 10. Then when I said, how many do you have? He said 6. So I would have just assumed, oh, he can count to 10. But that KEA evidence gave me that little bit of extra insight with him.
Very good. In what ways has the KEA strengthened your abilities to better understand and attend to the integration of the whole child teaching, not just a child's academic needs?
Well, during your KEA assessments, you spend some extra one-on-one time with the children. You have some conversations with them, and you get to witness their abilities, and you really get to know their personalities pretty quickly. And I felt like I got to know them each in an individual way that sometimes without KEA it would have taken me a little longer to get to know each child as an individual. So I think that KEA is a really helpful tool with that, where you really get to know each child.
And I will say, Denise, that is one of the, I think, the positives for the KEA is that it does help us see all the domains. Like, it focuses on the 5 domains of learning, and it also sometimes it helps you drill down to find that problem. Like you said, sometimes you think it may just be one issue. So like if you were seeing a child count and half of his objects were on the right side and half his objects were on the left side of his body, he may only count the ones on his right side, but when you really start to drill down and look at crossing midline and different things like that, he may not have counted the ones on his left side, not because he couldn't, but because crossing midline was difficult for him. So sometimes having those multiple pieces of evidence and able to drill down and look at that whole child, knowing that one domain of learning definitely affects the other domain of learning and affects our academic success and development, really helps us to dig deeper and helps us to problem solve sooner. So I appreciate your comment on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I really do feel like it's easier to get to know that child and that strength or weakness, and so you're not exactly stabbing in the dark or just assuming that that child knows, you know, this or can do this and that just because they've shown you some evidence on the surface. You're digging a little deeper, and it helps you to be able to pinpoint what things that you could actually do to help that child with that specific weakness.
Denise, can I ask a quick question? This is Carmen, and I love the idea of really kind of focusing in on the individual student. I even wrote in the notes that, you know, I really think that that's an important piece of even relationship building, to understand and to get to know your students. You've talked a little bit from this aspect of kind of individual student support. Can you tell us if there's a way, if this is even possible, is there a way that this kind of informs your instruction? So you mentioned that you see kind of this evidence for the 5 domains as it relates to individual students, but when you think about it across your classroom, is there a way that using this information helps you inform your instruction for the entire class?
Well, I do, because I try to give open-ended questions so that, you know, the child who isn't able to have a more complex answer, but maybe a lower answer, and also the child who might have a more complex answer, can both benefit, and they can both have a chance to give an answer. That it's a lot about confidence building with the children. And when you know them and you trust them and they trust you, they have a lot more confidence and they don't feel like, oh, I can't. And you're able to give those opportunities in your classroom as with whole group instruction, whole group time, to give them that opportunity to have that moment to shine, even if it is at their level versus a higher level. You're still able to know, oh, I know that child can answer that question. I'm going to call on him so that he can have that moment in the spotlight.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah. So in that same light, that's kind of the essence of MTSS. So considering the whole child when problem solving and making decisions, how have you used the KEA evidences and data in KEA, in MTSS conversations at your school, your grade level, PLCs, administration, school counselor? How has what you've seen with those evidences gone beyond to work through an MTSS framework?
Well, I'm using the evidence from the beginning of the year KEA assessments to establish where I need to focus with each individual. And then along the way, all my other assessments, even daily of observations, but also my later KEA and all your M class and everything else like that, you're using those assessments and observations to say, oh, this is the intervention I need for this child, because that child needs that specific area strengthened. And it helps you to pinpoint activities that in a small group or sometimes even one-on-one, you will be able to make some improvement on that skill that's lacking. And if there's expected growth, then you can move on. If they don't grow as fast as you want, then you reevaluate and you say, this isn't working, I'm going to change this and I'll try something else, because not every activity that works for one child will work for the other. So you're constantly reevaluating based on what that child needs, and say, oh, they're progressing or they're not progressing. And it really does give you a clear knowledge of that specific weakness or that specific strength, so that you can make your interventions and your enrichment much more valuable experience for the child as an individual.
Fantastic. And I really love that point. This is Carmen, about how you really use all of the information. 2 things that I heard that come out of our critical components specifically are really thinking about that idea of problem solving. So using this information to really kind of drill down and understand your students a little bit better. And then also that idea of evaluating effectiveness of interventions, because I think that that's key, that along the way as we are intervening and as we're supporting students, we're also thinking about how we are measuring the effectiveness of those interventions. And we do have a quick question from Jade. And the question is, how does KEA fit in with the use of a universal screener in an MTSS framework? And how do these tools work together? And I would venture to say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the KEA could be a part of your universal screening system, because it's something that you use for all students throughout the year. And so while you know, I don't know that we describe it as a universal screener. I definitely think that it's a part of the data system that you have, and that it works in conjunction with those other multiple pieces and sources of data. Because I know, Denise, you mentioned looking at other ways that we evaluate kids. So it's not just the KEA, but then looking at did you say MAP data? Is that
MClass.
MClass, thank you. But like looking at MClass and some of those other tools as well to really get a good picture of the whole student. And then I would even venture to say, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that it also gives you a really clear picture of your class. So that then you can think about what are some instructional strategies that I need to work around, you know, to support my students. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I group my children with the guided math and with the guided reading, use the KEA along with the MClass assessments and observations to decide which children should be in my small group and which should be in my assisted small group. And based on what are their common needs and what are their common strengths and weaknesses, so that, and then usually my lowest performing children are in that group together, and often it's a very small group of 2 or 3, so that I can give them a lot more attention and interventions that are appropriate for them.
And one thing I would add, Carmen, this is Erica. I have a school in our region who's really been using this in the MTSS framework, and they said it really helps them see, like, use the KEA becomes the qualitative data to support the quantitative data. So one of their examples is if you have someone who on the MClass assessment maybe read and looks like they aren't able to do some things, but yet you've seen them be able to do that on numerous occasions in guided reading, it makes you start to dig deeper to think, why can they do this in guided reading, but they can't do it on this MClass assessment? So it makes you start to kind of dig deeper and look at that whole child and think, is it the timer? Is it because they're sitting with an adult during MClass and they're not during guided instruction, they're with their peers? So it kind of really helps to have the quantitative data support the qualitative data to make the appropriate instructional decisions to move that student's learning forward. And I really like how Denise highlighted that the construct progressions, to use them to enrich students and to remediate, because sometimes these construct progressions, we've heard teachers say that, oh, we only need to do the KEA for our students who are below grade level, but this our kindergarten entry assessment and the K-3 form assessment was intended for all students. So our kindergarten entry assessment construct progressions go from age 3 to age 6, and then for the K-3, they're age 3 to age 10. So they were intended to help enrich, remediate, and help those students who are performing on grade level. So
fantastic. We do have one more question really quickly too that came out of that, and the question is related specifically to, will this information be a part of our data warehouse basically that the state is putting out? And that's our ECAT system, and our MTSS portion of that will allow us to utilize some data. At this point, I'm not sure, but I certainly will advocate that this will be a part of that dashboard as well, so that you can already have this information. I think one of the things that the division is constantly working on is alignment. So if there are things that we're asking people to utilize across the state, we'll make a concerted effort to ensure that those things are available in ECAT. So I don't want to say yes for sure, because we just don't have a list of all of those things that will be included, but I'm hopeful that it will, and I know that we're really being thoughtful and intentional about including the things that we're asking people to use across the state. And this was one of our stopping points, I think, too, just to ask people if they had a question that they wanted to ask out loud. So if you want to unmute and ask your question, you know, feel free to do that.
Yeah, they can just raise their hand. If they raise their hand, we can unmute you for you. I don't see anyone with their hand raised.
Okay, we do have one more question from Tiffany at Lincoln Charter. Good morning, Tiffany. The question is KEA going to be mandatory for schools to use? Now, Tiffany works at a charter school. I know, Erica, you and I kind of had this conversation, but can you talk a little bit about the difference, or how we're asking schools to utilize this now?
Okay, so for traditional public schools, the KEA is mandatory as part of the Read to Achieve law. It's one of the 7 pieces of that. So the kindergarten entry is mandated for traditional schools, but for charter schools at this point, it's still optional. But if a charter school wants to learn more about that, then it is our job to come out and support you and provide all the information and resources for that. So if a charter school looks at our information and decides this is something that could be useful to them, then we are, it is our job to come out and support you and help you get started with that, just like we would with any other traditional school. And we have had a couple charter schools, especially ones who are focusing on that whole child, who have been interested and feel like it does support them and gives them some information in the K2 world that they don't have right now. And so if you're interested in that, I would love to talk to you more and come out and help you with that.
And let me make a quick note that our contact information is going to be available on the handouts. The handout that we send to you, it's also available at the end of the PowerPoint. So we'll pause on that page so that if you do, or if you would be interested in contacting us, we'll make sure that you have that information.
I do see that someone said KEA, are they asking if the KEA is mandatory K through 3 or just K? So as of right now, the KEA is only mandatory. So it's just mandatory in kindergarten. However, there is a law that talks about the kindergarten through 3rd grade formative assessment will be we're moving that way, but part of that law says when approved by the state board. So currently we have some schools that are in early adoption who are starting to use the kindergarten through 3rd grade progressions this year and next year. And so what we're hoping to learn from them is what worked well, what barriers did you experience? And once we see the kind of information we're getting, then our division director of the Office of Early Learning will take that to the state board. Those K through 3 construct progressions have already been developed. The process is there. The kindergarten entry assessment was really only intended to be to make a child profile of that child and then to use that information kindergarten through 3rd grade. But to answer your question, it's only mandatory in kindergarten right now, but it will be mandatory in the future, kindergarten through 3rd grade, if the state board approves that.
Erica.
Yes.
Looking forward at that part of it and thinking about the MTSS side of things, will 1st grade teachers have access to kindergarten data and evidences? Will 2nd grade have access to kindergarten and 1st grade and so forth, just to use that as kind of historical data to follow them and help make some of those decisions based on past experiences?
Yeah, so when it does move to kindergarten through 3rd grade, like our schools that are in early adoption right now, so our 1st grade teachers who are in early adoption can go back and look at everything that was entered in kindergarten. So that was the vision for the K3 form of assessment, is that we collect these evidence, then we also see how they change and grow over time to help us make good instructional decisions kindergarten through 3rd grade. So that data will always be there. The way I kind of look at it, when it used to be the student assistance team and RTI, like sometimes we would meet and have conversations, and then we might pass a kindergarten teacher. I'm in the hallway and I'm a 2nd grade teacher, and then I'll kind of say, oh, we're talking about this child and in the RTI process or in the student assistance team and blah, blah, and the kindergarten teacher says, oh, well, didn't you know that they were blah, 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 and gives me tons of information. So knowing that kindergarten through 3rd grade continuum can be so important in a child's learning, we want that information that kindergarten teachers know and see and learn to be just as visible for a 1st grade teacher. So it helps them drill down to see why were they able to do this in kindergarten, but all of a sudden now in 1st grade they can't. So it helps even an administrator to see, is it the teacher's personality? Is it, that they have some things going on at home? So to have that data follow them through 3rd grade is there to drive instruction and improve student learning, and that's why they'll have access to that. So
perfect. All right, so Ms. Scott, how has using KEA evidences helped to improve and strengthen your understanding of problem solving within the MTSS framework?
Well, the evidence that I gathered gives me a starting point to work forward from with each child. And I know what the child still needs to work on, even if they're above that expected level. Like if they're even in that beyond, then I know what they can do. So I challenge them from there. And I can also quickly pinpoint which students would fit into each tier of instruction, like which ones are tier 1, 2, or 3 right away. And I can also gather evidence along the way that can guide me to change their tier as I need it. And I'm much more likely to give that extra instruction to a child that I'm noticing is sliding behind, or definitely from the beginning needed to be in a tier 2. And I like that that evidence can pinpoint a specific problem in a student who was maybe on target last month and now he's struggling. And all I have to do is notice that his needs are changing, his ability is not keeping up with those peers in the same group. And I know that I have to stop and do interventions with him to prevent him from sliding farther back. So I think it's important to remember that your students' tiers can change during the year. I've had children where they were a tier 2 and based on my KEA and other observations, and we worked really hard on interventions at home and at school, one-on-one, small group, and so on. And they ended up not needing the extra instruction a few months later. So you just have to remember that they're flexible as long as you are pinpointing their needs. They don't have to be in a tier 2 forever or tier 3.
And I do have to commend Ms. Scott and the teachers of Oak Grove Choice STEM. This is actually the school's first year in operation. Obviously, Ms. Scott has done KEA at other schools before this year, but one thing that I know KEA has helped with, their counselor kind of spearheaded their MTSS to get it up and going, just bringing in the social worker, the counselor, the principal, the school nurse, all of those outside, behind the scenes stakeholders type people, so that they can discuss those issues. So if Ms. Scott has students that she's concerned about and worried about, if it's something emotional that she can notice through emotional literacy, she can send that off to that team to have that discussion, and what can they do on their ends with their expertise to help come to some sort of a solution through intervention to help with that. So some of these KEA constructs really play into the emotional, behavioral side of things, more so than always just the academic. There are those supports in place to help spearhead and get the ball rolling with some of those things that she may not always have the opportunity to see or be able to do, that some of those other experts in the building can do also.
And Lynn, I want to thank you for bringing that up, because that's, to me, when I started this project, that was part of the beauty of this, was that our platform allows all the specialists to be added, tutors to be added, teacher assistants to be added to the platform. And so the PE teacher, who better to look at fine motor and gross motor than the PE teacher? Who better to collect evidence on social emotional than the guidance counselor? And this assessment was intended for us to do that. So we talk about like these children belong to all of us, but sometimes I think classroom teachers sometimes feel like everything falls on them. So the more people who are involved in collecting these evidence on the platform, the more it really gives you a true picture. So that way you can see that the EC teacher, if they're going to the EC teacher or speech therapist, they can be added to the platform and collect the evidence. So when a teacher goes in, they can see what the speech therapist or the PE teacher has put in the system, and they think, well, why can they do this in the exceptional children's classroom, but they can't do it here? Is it that they're in small group setting here and they're able to show their learning, or is it that they do more hands-on activities in the EC teacher than I do? So it really, again, helps you kind of drill down to figure out what's going on with this student and how can I drive their instruction. So knowing that all those stakeholders can be a part of this and that they all can see each other's evidences, I think really helps to problem solve for students.
And I think that goes back to that critical component about collaboration and communication, because I think that, and I love the point that you made, Erica, about this being this is not your student or my student. We at this school support all students, and so really allowing everyone to be a part of this, the process, I think, is extremely important. We did have one question from the field as well, from Tara in Union. She just said, for those of us that are not familiar with the assessment, tell us a little bit more about when it's done and how. So is it once a year? Is it monthly? Can you tell a little bit about kind of how that works?
And I'm happy to answer that, but would Lynn or Denise, would you like to answer that coming from the field, or would you like for me to take that one?
I can tell you when I use it. I do the social emotional in the first week of school. I also usually do another, capture another piece of evidence around this time of the year so that we can show a growth. I had a child that had tantrums when it was time for his mother to drop him off. We had to put a barricade at the door so they didn't try to run. And within a week, he was smiling and happy and had no problems coming in the room. And I took evidence of both of those things. I like to get the first assessment pretty much in the first couple weeks of school, because I want to know what they're coming in with. And that way, right away, I know where to direct my instruction and extra attention onto which children. And then I like to gather the evidence throughout the time period to show, hey, I see this child has growth, let me document this. The minute I'm sure that he's got it, I love to document that right away. And the kids actually, because they see this testing, even the M-class testing, as such a positive thing that I tell them they get to show off to me how smart they are, how great they are, whatever. They are excited about the testing. They're not nervous, and it really develops our rapport. Once again, it's a lot of the time it's a one-on-one setting, especially with M-class, but with this KEA, I like to gather as much evidence as I can, but focusing on the beginning few weeks of the year, just to see where they are when they walk in my door before I have much influence on them.
And Tara, truthfully, in its entirety, KEA is really a 60-day window, going from the first day of school until day 60, for instance, this year is November 17th, just to kind of close out and watch for that growth on that progression throughout that 60-day window. So as far as evidence is being entered, setting those status summaries, all of that is really done at the beginning of the year, hence the name Kindergarten Entry Assessment. That is not to say that nothing can be done with it beyond day 60. Teachers can still continue to watch for that growth and help students move along on that progression. There is just no requirement beyond day 60 that anything be added to or be done with that system. Teachers still have access to it. Teachers can still go in and add evidences and watch the progression of that child. There's just no requirement beyond day 60 for the kindergarten component of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Lynn. And the way y'all described it is really, it's really not done just once a month, or there's not a requirement for that. It's really whatever helps a teacher drive their instruction and help with their planning. So because it's a formative assessment process, a teacher collects evidence when they feel it's appropriate. So they have these construct progressions that are very fine grained that kind of provide a roadmap in all the 5 domains. So a teacher may notice, so if they were looking at hand dominance, they may notice that this student already has a dominant hand. So if they collect that evidence the first few weeks of school and can see that they have shown a dominant hand at several different places at school, they may not come back and gather another evidence until the end of October. So they may come back and check in again to see, is this student still really using their dominant hand, and they've established that. So it's really, some teachers may collect 7 or 8 pieces of evidence on a student during that 60-day window, where another student, they may only collect 3 pieces of evidence. So it's really whatever helps you drive your instruction. And so those evidences more, are hopefully being gathered as it's embedded during instruction. So it's those things that teachers notice on a daily basis that maybe they didn't record. So it provides like a structured system for us to collect that, so we can use it in these MTSS processes and to problem solve for students. So the KEA, even though it's required in the K through 3, is not, it was always intended to be one entire assessment. So the KEA, because it's a 60-day window, a lot of people will say, why is it called the kindergarten entry when it lasts for 60 days? And the reason that is that when we used to use developmental screeners, sometimes we would do those the first week of school and we would make lots of decisions about students, but then we may not revisit that information that we collected, even though that we could see that children were either advanced or behind in their motor skills and some of their cognitive things. We may not revisit that developmental screener again until the end of the year to see if they've grown. So knowing that children can enter kindergarten looking one way, but after being in a structured environment with lots of language and instruction, they can change. So, I mean, I think about when I was a first grade teacher, kids would come in and I think, whoa, we have, a lot of work to do with some students. But then in October, those same students were soaring. And I would say to my teacher assistant, can you believe that that is the same kid that came in the first week of school? But because there was some instruction and lots of language and providing this structured environment, a kid could show what they really could do, where we had made decisions about them the first week of school and may not have revisited that information. So, so anyway, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
All right, so moving along, Ms. Scott, can you share an example of a child who you feel like has benefited by the use of the KEA?
Last year and also this year as well, but we haven't seen growth yet. But last year, I had a child that for the life of her could not count those cubes to do the object counting. And so I spent a lot of extra time one-on-one and small group modeling how to count using the different techniques, including moving the manipulatives, making a tower out of them, whatever. And when we were counting them, we would use a louder voice or something, or a silly voice or something when we said the final one. And so she gained that knowledge through that experience that I gave her in a small group or one-on-one setting. And within a few weeks, I was able to capture that evidence of her successfully counting to 10. She moved the objects, she counted them, she said that final number last, louder, and if I asked her, how many do you have? 10. Now, if I give you another one, I have 11, and I didn't even expect her to tell me that. She went above what I actually thought she could do, and it was really rewarding for her, it was rewarding for me, and it showed that I really did apply that KEA evidence in the beginning of the year to meet her needs.
Fantastic. I'm looking to see if we have any additional questions, but at this time we don't. Oh, wait a minute, we do. So we do have one question. From Jade, does the process look any different for ESL students or newcomers? While I don't have the progressions in front of me, I would imagine that these students may take longer to reach progressions based on their language distance, culture, experience, and literacy in native language, etc. So have you had that experience, Ms. Scott, in terms of working with students who might be English language learners? Or Erica, could you speak to how the state might be supporting English language learners with the KEA?
Well, I think one thing that is important just to note is that unlike M-Class, there is no set benchmark of where we are saying students, excuse me, should be for the KEA constructs. We're not saying that by this point, the average typical kindergartner should be a C on this progression or should be an F on this progression. It's really just pinpointing and discovering where kids are naturally and where to go to get them to that next level. I think that's part of one thing that teachers do appreciate, that they don't feel strapped that they've got to get them necessarily to a certain point, because it is just about the growth and development of that individual child. So therefore, EL students and exceptional children, students in the exceptional children's program, students who come in late from another district, another state, somewhere along the way, they may not be at the same place, and that's okay for KEA. It's just about finding where they are, meeting them where they are, and helping them to grow from there. Ms. Scott may be able to speak a little more on that.
Well, I've had both experiences. I had an ELL student last year who didn't talk very much at all, and I think it was just his personality. Even the ELL teacher couldn't get him to talk very much, even in Spanish or in English. But I took where he was and what he could do, and we went from there. And he could, for example, the counting, he could only verbalize 1 and 2. That's all he knew. That's all he could do. But throughout the KEA time and of course the rest of the year, I knew that language was an issue that I wanted to work on with him, not just counting, but language as a whole. And then I've also had students come in later in the year. I just got a new student in my class a couple weeks ago, and I went ahead and started assessing him with the KEA, and I'm making my observations. And same thing as with any of the other children, though. I just took him where he was, and I'm working with him from there. And yes, he's not where a lot of the other kids have grown, but that's my job, is to get him there.
And I'll just, reiterate what you've already said, Lynn, is that we worked with Margaret Heritage, who has written a lot of books on formative assessment, and she's from England. And so she always used to talk about how in America we do things that do disservice to children because we're always talking about what they can't do, and what this K-3 formative assessment process is about is what children can do. So she always says they're perfect right where they are. And so they're perfect right where they are because developmentally, sometimes kids are, especially in that K2-3 world, that they developmentally aren't ready to move forward. So this assessment allows us to identify where children are, and that's okay where they are. And now what do I need to do as a teacher to move their learning forward? So it's really a growth-based model, growth-based assessment where we're always just looking, here's where children are, and as a teacher, what do I need to do to move their learning forward, which is why we have the whole child and the 5 domains, because sometimes it's not just about cognitive. So I might be teaching a guided reading lesson and they look red and can't do one thing, but as I drill down and start to look at their approaches to learning and different areas, it might be that they're really, really shy, or they're perfectionists and they won't take a risk. So sometimes it's about addressing children in different areas in order for them to be able to show their true knowledge in the academics. So we've had some questions about ESL students, and like in immersion classrooms, they'll say, well, how do we assess this? And so we have suggested, that you can assess children, and using this platform that we have, you can say, oh, well, they're on the skill level C in English, but in Spanish, they're on skill level F. So then you're able to see that when I talk in their native language, they're able to perform a lot higher than when I present this in English. So it allows you to collect that type of evidence and to be able to look at that evidence to problem solve appropriately and to drive your instruction appropriately. And I'll say one other thing is that a lot of exceptional children teachers who have severe and profound students, they're required to do the kindergarten entry. And at first there were some concerns like, my students aren't able to do this, they're severe and profound. And so what we've learned from them is that we've had a lot of positive comments, because they said we're able to share in parent conferences what some of the things that they can do. So we can highlight some other areas because we are looking at the whole child. We're able to highlight some things that they can't do, where if we were only talking about academics, then we were always talking about what their students couldn't do. So they've actually found a lot of positives in using this and looking at the whole child, because you're able to have some positive things to share with parents that their children are doing, and being able to share that with them.
Great. I'm looking to see if we have any additional questions, but it looks like that's the end of those questions for right now. And I don't see anyone raise their hand. Great.
All right. So how we said that KEA can go beyond day 60. Ms. Scott, how have you used the data of the KEA to intervene and support your students' growth beyond that day 60 mark?
Well, through KEA, it became very evident to me that documenting is so important to me. Being able to serve each of my students and documenting their performance is something that now I do every day. When they're in my small group, I might even take notes in a large group setting. Just hold on a second, guys, and I write something down on my notebook, something that concerns me or something that is new for that child that they are able to do for the first time. And it helps me to flag their strengths and their weaknesses at any moment. And I'll take that extra time to address that, okay, this child isn't getting this idea or this concept, but the other students in their small group or the other students in the class are. And when I'm documenting, I'll note to myself that I'll take extra time to work with that specific child on that skill. And usually I'll note what I've done. And all of those things are hugely helpful, like you said before, in parent conferences. Those are also great to have that documentation between KEA and your own documentation on a regular basis. If they're going through a testing process, they want us to give as much documentation as possible, but every day, I mean, it only takes you a minute to write down something about each child, and it's really important for you to be able to take that for yourself and go from there. And so I never valued documentation the way I do now, thanks to KEA. But it also indicates for me not just the child's weakness, but once again, this child is really excellent at this kind of skill. I'm going to take that child beyond. And maybe the other kids in that small group aren't ready for beyond, but that child is. And so I'm going to make sure that I address that with that specific child. But it's funny because the others will pick up, especially in a small group, what I'm doing, and they gain from it as well.
All right, so from that data and your documentation, how do you set short and long-term goals for your students, and how do you monitor and gauge their progress along the way?
Okay, well, my number one rule, like I just said, is document, document, document. My number two rule now, after all this KEA experience that I've gained from, is that I'm going to use that information. I'm going to change what I'm doing if I need to. If it's not working, I need to change. I can't expect a child to gain if I'm not addressing them where they are and with a strategy that they would benefit from specifically. So I document things daily. I set short-term goals and for every child, and I set those for about a couple weeks at a time. And I don't want to tackle too many issues. I want to tackle one or two issues, usually one at a time. And once that issue is resolved, move on to another issue. And we need to set those baby steps that are manageable for the child to gain, and then move on when they've gained from whatever strategies I've used that have worked. And they get so excited when hey, I can do that now. And then that makes them a little bit more motivated to move on to the next goal. I have long-term goals that are probably about 2 months out for most kids, sometimes a month or month and a half. And if they meet those goals before then great. I'm going to give them even more challenges and keep them advancing at their individual rate. And even for my lower kids, I set those long-term goals of a couple of months, because by the end of this marking period, I want this child to be at this level, or I want this child to be able to do this or this. And how do I get them there? And if they're not keeping up with that goal, they're not meeting it, then once again, I need to change what I'm doing, because whatever I've done isn't working for that child. And why waste time? If I'm noticing that's not working, I'm going to change it and try something else. And of course, this is a good time for you to consult with your co-teachers that in your grade level or a little bit above or below your grade level to say, I'm having trouble with this child. I've tried this, this, this. What's something that you think I can use that I haven't tried yet? And you don't know everything. And, each child's a little puzzle. So you've got to figure it out for their benefit.
Well, and I think another good point is teachers are not in this alone, or they don't have to be in this alone, that there is the opportunity for other people to have access and be able to give their own evidences. Music, art, PE teachers, counselors, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, office staff, all those kind of people can chime in and give their 2 cents, so to speak, along the way of conversations they've had with students and interactions and experiences from when students have been with them. So it's not just tied to Miss Scott's name, for instance. There are other people that if she knows something, there's a specific activity in PE today, the PE teacher can make some of those evidences, or she can go down there while the PE teacher has his lesson and is able to gain some evidence from there. So it's not just her alone all the time. She does have that capability of reaching out and having evidences that occur naturally in the student's environment beyond the 4 walls of the classroom.
That's great. And one of the things that we just had a question about, and I think you answered it even without me asking it, was really just about that collaboration in terms of school staff. So just to clarify, do ESL teachers, counselors, psychologists have access to all students, like all student data, or just the classroom teachers? So like if we wanted other people to provide those evidences, or we wanted to use this information, who has access to that?
So the principal or the district point can decide who has access to each teacher's classroom, and so you can give them access in different ways. So if a district point person or a principal thinks this is really important for the ESL teacher to have, and I want them to be a part of gathering this evidence and viewing this evidence, they can allow them and add them as a team member or as a co-teacher. So then they are able to view each other's evidence as they've uploaded. So the principal or district point person makes that decision, but I will say the people who have involved those people have found the most success, especially in the MTSS framework. We have a school who they started using the KEA, and they used that as part of their first week of school, and they identified like maybe 4 students who were at skill A on emotional literacy, but the majority of the students were on skill C. So they knew those 3 students kind of stood out, maybe having some things they may need to intervene on. So the guidance counselors came part of those conversations and started providing interventions, but she also provided interventions to the teacher and explained to the teachers how they could use that same intervention in their classroom. So where before those teachers, this was their quote, we used to view those specialists as the person who relieved us and gave us free time. Now all of a sudden those specialists became really important because they know their specialty is in social emotional, and the PE teacher specialties in fine and gross motor. So where before they viewed them as the person to give them a free period, now they became a really resource for those people, and what can then we do? So they started reaching out to the guidance counselor, and she came in and modeled some of those interventions. So they really became an important part of the process, and everything didn't fall on the teacher. So again, the principal and the district point person can give those access to those individuals.
And I think that, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Erin.
Go ahead, Carmen. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just, one of the things that I think in this conversation, I think I'm hearing consistently, and this is why we have the conversation, because I know that sometimes as a coordinator, if you're a district coordinator, if you work at a school, sometimes you feel like you have all of these different roles and all of these different things that you are tasked with doing. And the truth is that a lot of the work that we do is aligned. And so, as we're having this conversation, as Ms. Scott's talking, as Lynn and Eric are talking, I pull pieces of everything that we've said and think about each one of those 6 critical components that we talked about at the very beginning. And I can't see where there's any delineation between this work and those 6 components. It really enhances that leadership because people have access to what they need to have access to and the evidences. It builds capacity because Ms. Scott really talked about the idea of constantly documenting, knowing what to do for students immediately, monitoring that effectiveness, and looking at the data. So, I really think it's great that we're able to kind of point out how all of these things are aligned. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Erica.
No, I was going to say the exact same thing, and just how I agree with you. And also, like when you hear Ms. Scott talk about how she jots down a note, the platform that we have and the app that we have, actually you can gather evidence through a picture, through a video, through an audio note. So sometimes the platform, because anything when it's new technology, sometimes feels a hindrance. It was really created to support teachers to make that evidence gathering easier. So if I just want to take a picture of someone crossing midline, or I want to take a small video of them counting out loud, I could do that rather than have to type it all out or write it out. But the flip side of that, if I'm the teacher who's always taking notes, I don't want to have to change what I already do in my classroom. So I can take those notes and just take a picture of the notes and upload it to the platform. So it's really intended to help fit into your instructional day and to make it as easy as possible for you. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that, since Ms. Scott mentioned that she was jotting notes down, but just know that there's different ways to collect that evidence in our app and our platform. And really just in reference to the short-term and long-term goals, I know that the KEA ends at the 60th day, and a lot of districts stop on that 60th day because that's what the law says they have to do, is collect the status summary on the 60th day and report that to the state, and they're finished. But because it's a form of assessment process, it was never intended to stop on the 60th day. It was intended to go, ongoing. And that's why these progressions for kindergarten entry go from age 3 to age 6, and the K3 go from age 3 to age 10. And so there'll be lots of kindergarten students who, even at the end of the school year, will not be at the end of the progression, and that's okay. And you can run a report to see where your students in your class and in your district are kind of functioning on each progression. And so when you see half of your students, or over half of your students, are still on skill B, but the skills go all the way to F on a construct progression, stopping at the 60th day, I'm not really sure why you would do that, just knowing that our students aren't finished learning and developing, but it's the 60th day, we're going to stop, but they're only on skill B. So just as far as good instructional strategies and good planning, if you know those about students, you would continue that process long after the 60th day. So I don't know if, Lynn, if you and Ms. Scott would add anything about how y'all are doing that in Stanley County, if you're stopping at the 60th day, or how that's benefited you to continue after the 60th day.
As far as any kind of requirements and data evidence entry into the platform itself, we don't really have a requirement for that. But as we were talking earlier, we do continue to have those conversations in grade level planning, in our PLCs, in any type of MTSS conversations that happen within the building, just because that is another piece of data that we can use to help support where students are and getting them to that next level. So we don't really have a set requirement for teachers to go in and input anything. That's not to say that we don't still have teachers who do, because we do have teachers that continue to keep that evidence, just because it's a place to house that for parents and conferences and needs that may arise in the spring. But we do continue to use KEA and those constructs and the progressions as we move forward with discussions focused on the student.
I don't think there's any more questions. Do you see any more, Carmen?
I don't. I was just looking through that as well to make sure we had answered all of them. And I don't see any more.
I know we're getting close to our time. We want to honor that time because our time was set for 9 to 10. It's 9:57. So if I don't see more questions, I'll go ahead to the next slide. And it's really just our contact information. It's our email. If you need to have additional questions, feel free to contact Carmen or me, or I'm sure Lynn and Denise would also answer any questions, and sometimes answering those questions from the field makes it more meaningful, I know, but we're happy to answer those in any way that we can. We have our wiki addresses at the bottom where you can find lots of resources. If you want to know more about the kindergarten entry assessment or the K3 form of assessment, there's our wiki, and as well as the MTSS wiki.
Exactly. And this information I also include on the handout that I'm typing notes in right now.
And this is Denise. My last name is not on that contact information. My last name is Scott, and mine is the same base address as Lynn's is, denise.scott@stanleycountyschools.org, but anybody who doesn't remember or write that down can always just forward something through Lynn. He can get forwarded to me, and I'd be happy to answer questions along the year.
Okay, and I put your first and last name in the chat box if anyone didn't catch that.
I'm also putting it in our notes.
Okay. And thank you for saying that, Denise, because I know you're really busy being a kindergarten teacher, so answering emails just add more to your day, but I think you can provide a lot of insight just because you're in the field doing it every day, so you can answer questions sometimes better than we can.
Yeah, I'd be happy to help anytime.
So I think if we don't have any other questions, we're happy to stay on and answer those questions, but we don't want to keep you. We know it's 9:58, but we appreciate so much of you being a part of this, and we really appreciate Lynn and Denise Scott sharing their information with us, because they're in the field doing this every day, and they're encountering the barriers and successes that both of our initiatives can have. So we just appreciate you being here today.
It was really great to be able to help out. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. certainly appreciate it. And thank you to all of you that have joined the call. I hope that it's been enlightening and providing you just some information about the KEA or MTSS if you didn't have knowledge of either or one or the other. So I hope it's been helpful.
And
Eric,
Carmen, I'm sorry, go ahead, Carmen.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, can you kind of let them know what to expect afterwards in terms of they'll get a survey because we want to know if this was useful, and they'll get that via email, or does GoToMeeting kind of provide that as soon as it's over?
The GoToWebinar will send an email out like about an hour after we finish, and it'll have the valuation link in there. And we have recorded the session today, so we'll download that and share that out through Carmen, and I will share that out through our contact people. So that will be recorded in case you wanted to share that with someone else. It was recorded today. So then also I wanted just to say, if you're still kind of thinking how these two initiatives work together, I know Carmen and I have talked about in the past that we'd be happy to come out together and problem solve and to show how these two initiatives work together. So just let one of us know, and we're happy to work out a schedule to come out and speak with and help y'all in any way that we can.
Thank you.
So if there's not any other questions, we just want to thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful Friday, and enjoy your weekend.
Yes, everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.